bleeds, he disappears from view for a while, but he never truly breaks. David Allan Coe is that kind. There is a particular kind of man who does not break under pressure. He bends, he of man. At 85 years old, with a lifetime of prison bars, open highways, broken contracts, and blacklisted records behind him, he has done something that no amount of money, influence, or industry power could prevent. He has finally told the truth. And that truth, delivered with the quiet fury of a man who has been waiting decades to speak it, has landed on Nashville like a wrecking ball on a glass house. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of his music career, but the beginning of David Allan Coe himself. David Allan Coe was born on September 6, 1939, in Akron, Ohio. From the very first years of his life, the world made it clear that it did not have a comfortable place for him. His mother struggled, his home was unstable, and by the time he was 9 years old, he had already been placed in a reform school. That is not a statistic. That is a child, still young enough to believe in fairness, being told by the system that he was already a problem to be managed rather than a person to be raised. What followed was years of institutional life. Juvenile detention centers, reformatories, and eventually adult prisons became the landscape of his youth. While other boys his age were learning to drive and attending school dances, Coe was learning how to survive in places where weakness was dangerous and trust was a luxury. His stepmother had reportedly demanded he be handed over to the courts, keeping his sister but turning him away. That rejection, that primal wound of being unwanted by the very people who were supposed to protect you, never fully left him. But something remarkable happened inside those walls. Coe began to write. He began to sing. And in the talent shows held inside those institutions, he discovered that his voice carried something real, something that cut through the concrete and the silence and landed directly in the chest of anyone who heard it. He was not performing for applause. He was performing because it was the only honest language he had found. Those early songs, raw and unpolished and soaked in the reality of confinement, became the foundation of everything that came after. When Coe arrived in Nashville in the late 1960s, he did not come quietly. He drove a hearse and parked it outside the Ryman Auditorium, living out of it while he worked to break into an industry that had no idea what to do with him. He was tattooed and long-haired at a time when country music preferred its artists clean-cut and cooperative. He carried songs that did not fit neatly into any of the formats that radio stations were willing to broadcast. And yet he pushed forward, walking Music Row with a determination that bordered on stubbornness and crossed well into something deeper than ambition. The industry noticed him reluctantly. In 1973, Tanya Tucker recorded his song, Would You Lay With Me, in a Field of Stone, and it climbed straight to the top of the charts. Suddenly, David Allan Coe had proven that his writing could produce hits. Suddenly, Nashville could not completely pretend he did not exist. But acknowledging his talent was very different from welcoming the man who carried it. The executives who benefited from his songwriting still kept him at arm's length. The radio programmers who played records based on his words still hesitated to play records that carried his name. Because Coe, as a recording artist, was something Nashville genuinely did not know how to handle. His albums from that era were unlike anything else being released under the country label. They were raw and psychedelic and sometimes violent in their honesty. He wrote about prison and poverty and desire without cleaning any of it up for polite consumption. He mocked the formulas of country songwriting even while mastering them, as he demonstrated brilliantly with You Never Even Called Me By My Name, co-written with Steve Goodman, a song that named every element the genre required and laughed at itself while delivering them perfectly. He built a following not from radio play or awards show nominations, but from direct connection. Bikers and ex-convicts and working people who felt invisible to the mainstream found in David Allan Coe someone who sang their lives without apology. He was not giving them an idealized version of country experience. He was giving them the version they actually recognized. For any country artist of his era and his stature, the Grand Ole Opry represented the ultimate validation. It was the institution that separated the legends from the merely successful, the stage that conferred a kind of official blessing on a career. Artists who performed there could point to that moment as proof that they had truly arrived. David Allan Coe never performed there. Not once. Not as a guest, not as a member, not even for a single song during more than 6 decades of performing country music. That absence is not accidental. It is not an oversight. And Coe has spent years suggesting, carefully at first and then with increasing directness, that it was the result of a deliberate and coordinated effort to keep him out. The official reasons were never stated publicly. Various explanations circulated over the years. His criminal record, his Confederate flag guitar, his controversial lyrics, his general refusal to behave the way powerful institutions expected their artists to behave. Each of these was presented as a reasonable cause for concern by the people who benefited from having a reasonable explanation available. But none of them fully account for the totality of what happened to Coe's relationship with mainstream Nashville. Because it was not simply that he was not invited to the Opry. His name disappeared from programs. Radio stations that had once played his music quietly stopped doing so without public explanation. Award shows that acknowledged his peers overlooked him entirely. Booking agents withdrew from commitments without stated reasons. Documentaries about the outlaw country movement, a movement he had helped define and in many cases preceded, were produced without meaningfully including him. The erasure was comprehensive enough to suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Coe has hinted for years that his blacklisting was connected not just to his personality or his artistic choices, but to something he knew. Something he saw. He told friends about documents he had kept, recordings he had made, photographs that existed as insurance against the possibility that the people who wanted him silent might decide to do something more permanent about it. Most people who heard these stories filed them under the category of outlaw mythology. Coe was known for his larger-than-life persona, and it was easy to assume that his suggestions of hidden evidence were part of the same storytelling tradition that produced some of his most vivid song lyrics. That assumption turned out to be a mistake. In 2025, at 85 years old, Coe sat down for a lengthy recorded conversation on his Tennessee property. He was calm. He was specific. He had papers with him. He read from a handwritten letter that he attributed to a former Opry board member, a letter that acknowledged participation in a system that had deliberately kept Coe away from the institution and referenced a broken deal from 1981. He described a voice recording in which a now-deceased country star warned him to stay quiet about certain events or face serious consequences. He spoke about something he claimed to have witnessed backstage in 1977 involving an Opry official and a minor, an account he said he never brought to law enforcement because he feared that doing so would cost him everything, perhaps including his life. These are serious claims. They deserve to be treated seriously, and they also deserve scrutiny. Coe himself acknowledged that some of what he was presenting could not be independently verified and that some of the people involved were no longer alive to respond. But the emotional weight of a man at 85, with nothing left to protect and no career advancement left to pursue, speaking with the deliberate calm of someone recounting memory rather than performing grievance, is not easy to dismiss. The conversation was not intended for public release. It was filmed privately, and whatever arrangement existed around it broke down in a way that sent the footage into digital circulation before anyone could contain it. Within days of appearing online, it had spread across every platform where people talk about music and truth and institutional power. The reaction was immediate and divided along predictable lines. Longtime Coe fans who had spent years insisting that his exclusion from mainstream country recognition was deliberate felt the vindication of having been right. Younger listeners who had only a passing familiarity with his name began researching his catalog and discovering for the first time the scope of what he had contributed to American music. People who had grown up around the Nashville industry, retired musicians and engineers and session players, began speaking about things they had kept quiet for a long time. The Opry released a statement. It was careful and brief and said very little. It referenced a commitment to tradition and declined to engage with what it called unverified claims. That response, or rather the smallness of that response given the scale of what had been alleged, did more damage to the institution's credibility than any direct rebuttal might have done. When you have been accused of systematic blacklisting and the suppression of evidence of serious wrongdoing, and your public response is a paragraph about tradition, the gap between the accusation and the answer becomes its own kind of statement. Country radio, which had spent decades ignoring Coe, continued to ignore him. Major artists who had built careers within the Opry system said nothing publicly. The silence from people who absolutely knew what they were not saying was, in its own way, louder than anything they could have put into words. Outside Nashville, the response was entirely different. Fans organized. Social media campaigns spread. People who had never thought much about the politics of country music gatekeeping suddenly found themselves interested in a story that was really about something much larger than one artist's career. It was about who gets to be remembered, who gets to be erased, and what institutions will do to protect themselves from the consequences of their own behavior. By the time the full weight of the moment settled, something had shifted permanently. David Allan Coe's streaming numbers climbed sharply as people sought out his recordings. His concerts, which had continued steadily through the years in venues that valued authenticity over industry approval, began attracting larger and younger audiences. Artists who had been influenced by him began saying so publicly, crediting him for approaches to honesty in songwriting that they had absorbed without always acknowledging the source. But Coe himself has been consistent in saying that what he wanted was never simply commercial revival or late recognition from the people who had excluded him. What he wanted was for the record to be corrected. He wanted it known that his absence from the Opry stage was not the result of insufficient talent or insufficient effort. It was the result of a decision made by people who found him inconvenient, made in rooms where he had no voice and under circumstances that those people had every reason to keep hidden. He got that.